We're just having some technical difficulties. Our presenters on the attendees end and not the panelist end. So I'm just trying to work to get them onto the panelist end so they can do their presentation. Lauren, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
And you should be able to share your screen now if you have anything to share, and we're all set.
Wonderful. Shall I just dive right in?
Go on ahead.
Awesome. Awesome. Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you today. Let's see. I started my career, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. Started my career in animal welfare way back in '98 when I started volunteering at the Paws Wildlife Center. I had just moved to Seattle, the Seattle area, and I really wanted to meet cool people, my kind of people. So I started volunteering at a wildlife center. And 6 months later, the volunteer program manager position opened up and I got it. I was in absolute heaven. And it started me down a road that got me here, wanting to make a really important lived difference for people doing some of the most important work in the world. So let's get started and do some of that work. I want to start with a story. This actually happened to me while I was working at Paws. I would come in early sometimes. Sometimes I'd be the very first person there. And I would see at Paws, there's a wildlife center and there's a companion animal shelter separated by a parking lot. And I would be walking towards the wildlife center and I would see a dog tied to the railing. Somebody had come either early in the morning or late at night and had left the dog there so that we would find it and, do what needed to get done. And I remember thinking every time that happened, and it happened fairly regularly, once every month, every couple months, that dog is so lucky. Somebody took the time to bring it to Paws and make sure that it got in front of people that were going to do the right thing for it, that were going to make sure it got adopted, etc., and get medical care. And I just thought this was evidence of a really good thing. And then one day I show up at the same time as a woman who had worked at the companion animal shelter for maybe 8 or 9 years. And we see the dog, we're in the parking lot, we're talking, and we see the dog tied to the railing at the same time. And before I can have my own experience of like, oh, good, here's a dog that we get to take care of, she said, people dump dogs here all the time. And I was like, whoa, it really hit me how differently we saw that singular, very same piece of evidence. And that's because of how we had it framed, right? So framing gives us our whole experience. And I think it is fundamentally important, especially if we're going to be in high intensity environments, to be aware of our frame so that we can influence ourselves and take good care of our thinking. Okay, so that story comes from my real experience, and it is actually in an article I wrote that you can find. I can drop the link in the chat here for you. Oh, actually, I can only put it in for the panelists, but I'll make sure you get it. There's an article that you can find that tells that story and talks about a lot of what we're going to talk about here. So I want to share the goal for the day. This is our agenda. And this agenda is meant to get us to a goal, and that is to learn something that really reduces your suffering. Many of us suffer from persistent negative thoughts. We're in front of things constantly in this line of work that are hard to think about. And so many of us actually suffer from unrelenting negative thinking. And the more we think about these things, the more thinkable they become, the more they seem like the truth, and more like we just noticed reality, rather than, oh, this is how I'm perceiving things, and then I'm making things up this way, et cetera. We just sort of kind of think we notice the truth, right? So we want to get some relief from that. We want to bring awareness to it, and then bring some intentionality to the way that we generate our frames or generate new possible ways of thinking. So to do that, to reach that goal, we're going to talk about a model called the ladder of inference. We're going to talk about what framing is, what reframing is, some of the cognitive distortions that we all experience, every last one of us, and how you can actually reduce that unnecessary suffering. Because what I want you to do is leave with actual things you can do, not things to think about only. This is not just theory. This is actual behaviorally specific stuff you can do. And then we'll get to that, like what you can actually do. So, so with that said, let's get going to the ladder of inference. So this is a model that was developed by a professor at Yale, Chris Argyris. It was in 1970. And then in 1972, Peter Senge made it really popular in his famous book, The Fifth Discipline. And so everything I'm about to describe happens with lightning speed, this model. It's very fast, and that's why it's so helpful to break it down. This is really going to be describing how we interpret stuff and how we make meaning in the world. So, and this model helps us think about why eyewitness accounts often are very different. People who were standing right there in nearly the same spot, right? They say they see very different things, or they report very different things. This model helps understand how that can happen. Okay. So first, there's all the data. There's every single bit of data. And many of us know that human beings, we can't take it all in. Given all of our senses and all the data available to us, we would be completely overwhelmed if we processed all of it. So for all that data, we need to select certain data. And that selection is based on what's important to us in the moment, you know, how we're feeling, what we had for breakfast, what our values are, right? We all have these ways of seeing the world. So we're selecting various pieces of all the data. So inherent in that is we're disregarding some data. Then to the data we selected, and maybe even to some of the data we disregarded, but not to the data we didn't even see, we add meaning. We're adding meaning constantly to the things we're selecting and noticing. And the tricky part is we're noticing different meaning than others sometimes. And that's where the trick comes. So based on the meaning that we make about the data we selected, we create assumptions, right, about how things are and are not, or will or can be, etc. So we got these assumptions, then we're drawing conclusions based on these assumptions we have, sometimes and most often unchecked assumptions, right? Because again, this is happening at lightning speed. And then we develop these beliefs based on these conclusions that are set on these assumptions that are mostly unchecked. And then we take actions based on those beliefs, and those actions give us a whole new set of data, right? A whole new set of data from which we select. And mostly we're selecting things that are in agreement with our view of reality. Most of us don't say, I'm going to go look for contrary evidence, is what I call it. Most of us don't do that. But if we want to really be rigorous in how we're making meaning, we will look for contrary evidence. So what do I mean by that? For example, if I think, Johnny Schmo is really lazy and tries to avoid work and get out of stuff, and I see him over by the water cooler, maybe he even has a big bundle of papers in his arms, but he's over by the water fountain talking to somebody. And if I already have this notion that Johnny is avoiding work, I might look at Johnny and say, look at him, chat, chat, chat all day long, just chatting away. But if I actually think Johnny's a very hard worker, I might see the exact same scenario and go, Johnny's thirsty, glad he's hydrating, right? So that would be data. That's meaning I'm making based on the data over there, right? Very different scenario based on what I already believe. So what we believe really makes a big difference on what we think we're seeing. So seeking contrary evidence. So if I notice, let's say I'm a manager and I'm managing somebody in a wildlife center or anywhere, and I think this person's a real slacker, I might say, let's look for contrary evidence. What is that person really doing well at? Can I catch them working hard? Just to see if you can balance it out, because we normally just keep looking for the thing that we already believe to confirm our reality. So this is the ladder of inference. It is, behind the scenes, they say we go up and down the ladder, I don't know, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of times a day, right? It is absolutely the way we think. All the data, select the data, add meaning, and build assumptions, conclusions, and beliefs. Then we take more actions. So great thing to keep in mind as we go through this conversation, that you will be going up and down the ladder all through this training. You'll be making meaning about what I'm saying, and you'll be selecting certain parts of the training that resonate more for you, right? So it's happening right now as we're speaking. So this is always on in the background. I find it extremely useful, especially if we're in a misunderstanding. I can say, what meaning am I making, right? What am I telling myself here? Is that verified, right? So this is a very good thing to keep in mind, because it can help get you unstuck when you're like, wait, something's off here. It's probably in the data or the meaning that you added to it. All right. So let's go to the next one. So another way of thinking about that data and meaning making that I think can also be helpful is there's a thing called what actually happened. And that's what the video camera would capture, right? No value judgment, just simply a description of what's actually so. Then there's a whole other world of what I made up about what happened. That's our world of opinions, thoughts, value judgments, etc., desires. Now, the thing is, the reason why this is so important is because if somebody storms in the room and says something that makes it, that we want to call rude, if we report it as somebody was so rude and that's what happened, rather than somebody stormed in, said a bunch of stuff and it landed on me like rude, it might lend me to another part of a conversation where I'm wondering what's happening with them. I'm not offended in that. I'm just describing what happened. That's very different than coming from an offended place. It's almost like suspending judgment. You can still conclude that it was rude, but first you're going to inquire what happened, what actually just happened. Let me just separate that. There's a lot available in that. So I recommend experimenting with distinguishing these things. Sometimes it'll be big aharas, sometimes not, but the more you practice, the more you'll see it. Okay. So what is a frame? I want to show you what a frame is actually, just to give you some tangible experience right here in the now. So if I hold my finger up, right, like this picture, and I give you an external frame called numbers, what does that mean? Right? In the external frame of numbers, I'm guessing you interpret this to mean 1. When I say the order of things, the external frame is the order of things, I'm guessing that you're saying first. That would be what the frame would make this mean. Whereas the frame of numbers makes this mean 1. When I say direction, that frame makes this mean up. Right? So these are examples of externally given frames. The frames you're going to be working on are the ones you're giving yourself that are causing some thinking distress. Or, you know, those are the ones I want to point you towards. But first, we're going to notice this. These are externally given frames. Now, what do? Excuse me. What is a frame? It's a cognitive shortcut, right? It's a cognitive shortcut and an organizing determinant that helped you understand exactly what this meant given the frame. And it's living prior to conscious process. This is a thought process that exists from a long time ago, and it's just alive inside. And the frame and this image gives you exactly what the meaning is, right? So that's what a frame is. The frame gives us everything, just like it will give us that people dump dogs here, or people are kind and generous and go out of their way to get the dog cared for, right? It's really kind of like an accumulative interpretive lens. And it's based on our beliefs, our education, our values, our experience, and our biases, right? Our frame, our default frame is all of that stuff together. And there can be processing errors in there. And we're going to talk very specifically about one kind, the cognitive distortions, which is a very particular kind of error. So this is a cumulative interpretive lens that can really get messy if we're not careful and don't clean it up sometimes. So that's what we want to do. I want to help you see the lens that you're using so that perhaps you can develop some flexibility and freedom in there. Okay. So what do frames do? Right? They really define how you're able to conceive of any situation in any given time and the elements of situations, right? The frame defines what's good and bad, or even if good and bad exists, what's possible or impossible if those two things even exist, worthy, not worthy, etc. Right? It really scopes the whole set of possibilities available in whatever the conversation is. It contains all these predetermined and limited options for your thoughts, your feelings, and behaviors. The frame gives us that, right? So I want to tell you another quick story from the Tale of Piglet. I don't know if you've read the Tao of Pooh. Well, this is the second in the series. And they tell a story where there's a very poor old man and his son. They're living up in the upper regions of Mongolia, and they have one horse and they're very poor. And one day there's some thunder and lightning, and the horse breaks out of the corral and runs away. And all the neighbors run up to him, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, we're so sorry. This is terrible. Your horse ran away. This is very, very bad." And the old man, the wise old man, said, "Wow, how could you be so certain it's bad?" But he said thank you and carried on. And then the next day, that one horse brought back about 11 wild stallions, and the son was able to corral them in and bring them into the barn and set them up. And all the neighbors rushed in and said, "Oh, this is a wonderful thing. We're so happy for you. This is very, very good." And again, the old man was like, "How can you be so certain it's so good? That's very interesting." And they carried on. And then the next day, the son was trying to ride one of the wild horses, and he fell off and broke his leg. And the neighbors came over and they said, oh my gosh, this is terrible. He can't work in the fields. This is awful. What will you do? This is very, very bad. And again, the old man said, how can you be so certain? That's very interesting. And then the next day, the Huns from the north were coming down, recruiting all the able-bodied men to go to a war that they were never going to return from. And the son could not go because he had a broken leg. And so I love that story. I love that story because we just don't know yet what the ultimate is. And yet we get caught in the conversations of the neighbors. This is good. This is bad, rather than just noticing what is. All the meaning making we're doing is the neighbors going back and forth. This is good. This is bad. This is good. Making meaning from selected data, right? So a frame gives us all of that, right? All of that. And it can really trap us, especially because some of our frames are formed way, way back. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Well, right now. So first frames are what I call them, and our originating messages. These are messages we got in our first group. Our family of origin is the very first group we ever belonged to. And it's in that group. And that could be our birth family or not our birth family. And in that first group, we learn how to be and how not to be around all of these things here on the screen. We learn who gets to be angry, how you're supposed to be angry, how you're never supposed to be angry, how you make mistakes or how you're supposed to hide mistakes, how you're supposed to celebrate success or how you're never supposed to take time out for that because you got work to do. And I could go on and on. We have frames deep down for all of these things about what is and isn't acceptable, okay, etc. And we don't hold the same frame, so we're busy judging each other. You're not doing anger well. You're not doing it the right way. You're not making mistakes the right way. You don't say no enough. You say no too much, right? So we all have these different frames about what's okay and what isn't, what's powerful and what isn't, whether we're powerful or we aren't, right? So these first frames are given to us by the mind of a child. I want to say that one more time. These first frames really are given to us by the mind of a child, because if you think about it, you're there in your family of origin and all this stuff's happening around you and to you, and you're making stuff up. You're climbing up the ladder of inference all day long as a kid and making meaning about what this stuff around you means. And then we take those meanings and we carry them into adolescence. And because we have this reinforcing loop where we find stuff that proves what we're already in agreement with, we can reinforce those childlike beliefs. And some of them serve us. Some of them absolutely will serve us, and some of them absolutely won't, right? If you don't have any time to celebrate success, that's not something that's really sustainable in terms of building resilience, building team, all of that, right? These are all very important ingredients. So, so thinking about your first frames as things that got made up by a child that you now as an adult can influence. You get to influence these things. Not always easy. It's a lot of work sometimes. You know, I had to do a lot of work based on my family of origin around anger, because it wasn't something that felt safe. I would just want to go away and be like silent treatment. Whoever was, you know, I just didn't want to talk about any of it. Now I can. I did some work and now I can actually engage in conversations when somebody's angry or when I'm angry. So this is a deep well of development possibilities here for us. But I want to mention that here because so many of us are grappling with some of these first frames, right? If you're not allowed to ask for help because of the way you have it framed, that's going to give you a set of options and also take away a set of options. Okay. So I think I'm going to give you, I think we have time. I was thinking we needed to skip this because we started just a little bit late, but I think that I can give you a couple examples. I want to give you one more example. I gave you the anger one. You know, in my family, my stepmother, she yelled. She was really angry all the time when I was with her. And so I just wanted to shrink, right? A message I got, my originating message, my first frame is when someone's angry, go away, get small, hide, do whatever you got to do, get out of the line of fire, you know? And so I grew up with that originating message and I needed to work hard to change it. I also got this other, I mean, we all got lots of them, but another one that I've identified that's a really good one that I love, that I don't want to change, an originating message that's a great frame, works for me beautifully, is when I was young and I said I can't, or if I was like, I can't hit the ball, I can't catch it. My dad would say this one sentence over and over again. He gave me this frame. Of course you can, you just haven't yet. He said that to me hundreds of times growing up. And so and then I would prove him right, of course, because I would keep swinging. I'd swing 12 times and miss. And then the 13th time I'd hit it. And I'd be like, oh, you're right. That's how many times it took in order for me to get there. So I have that frame that if I just try hard enough, keep practicing, I'll finally get it. Doesn't always work, but it's a predominant frame and it's a good one. So making sure you identify these good ones as well, so you can build on them, amplify them, as well as identifying the ones that aren't working that well for you so that you can influence that. All right, so we get some of these frames are great, some of them are not so great. How do you reframe the public when they refuse to listen to your advice when they call you? I will tell you exactly how I do that. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a rock that a friend of mine gave me, and it's got this really interesting circle in it. It's like a half circle. You could put a golf ball in it and it would sit just like halfway. And this rock, now this is not a Pollyanna answer. This isn't like, oh, just do this and you'll feel better, because it really is hard to deal with people who you don't believe are listening to you when they ask you for advice, right? Yeah, throw the rock. No, because then you might lose it, and it's precious. I love this rock. It reminds me of exactly what you're asking about. And that is that this rock, it took 10,000 years of water dropping on this rock to cause this beautiful shape. Now, sometimes we are one drop of water. I'm not just making this up for your question. I have thought about this long and hard. We are one drop of water sometimes. We make a difference, but we cannot perceive it. We might be the third person they heard say that, and it might finally get in with the fourth, but we had to be the third, and we haven't got a clue about where we are in that person's process. So that is not an answer to make you love these conversations, but it is a reframe. It is exactly what we're talking about. I am one drop of water. I am not dynamite. Dynamite breaks up rocks, but it's very sharp and jagged. This is what one drop of water does for 10,000 years. Now, that's a slow rate of change, and we are in a hurry in this field to have some people wake up, right? I get that. But that is my wholehearted, my heartfelt answer, is that sometimes people seem like they're not hearing it. They seem like they're not listening, but we might actually be doing something. So thank you for asking. I really appreciate the opportunity to show you my rock. Okay, super. Let's see. Okay, so moving on. Here are some big pain causers, okay? These are called cognitive errors or cognitive distortions, and this is where you can really help yourself. These are some of the things that human brains do, right? As much as I teach this, as much as I study this, I do some of these things now and again too, because that's what our brains want to do. Now, I wish we had a 2-day workshop, like we could go into these and do exercises and clarify and get unhooked from some of our habits around these. But this is a place where you could really do yourself a huge favor by looking at, where are you filtering out? That's the data selection piece, right? We're selecting certain data and disregarding other data. Where are you doing that? This is another way of talking about that. Also, I want to mention overgeneralization. Notice in your language, where are you saying always, never, everyone, no one, nobody, right? All of those words indicate overgeneralization, because I can guarantee you can find an exception, right? I'm probably an exception. You're probably an exception. And most of the people on this call are probably exceptions. So it's very important to be specific, because your emotions are going to follow your thoughts. And if you're overgeneralizing and saying nobody cares, your feelings will be associated with nobody cares. And that's causing your own self some harm that doesn't need to be had, because there are people that do care, right? So discounting the positive is another one. Sometimes in this field, I believe we can be in minimizing the good stuff because there's still so much stuff that's bad that we have to go handle. So because we have this, excuse me, pile of things to handle, we don't want to take time to celebrate the pile that we did well. Right? So discounting the positive, not making time for it, minimizing it, those are cognitive distortions. Another one that I think is really important, that is a huge one that I have struggled with, is the fallacy of fairness. Like somehow I got the notion in my head that life is supposed to be fair, but that's not the truth. Nobody said that. There's no book of facts in the world that says, oh, let's look up, oh, things are supposed to be fair here. Things have been unfair since the very beginning, and they continue to be unfair. And so when I get stuck in that it should be fair, then I go into the next one here with the shoulds, right? Like I'm in an argument with the way things are, so I can't be with what's happened. I'm in my meaning making, and that's a much less powerful place to be. So I hope you can see in this small glimpse into how some of these distortions show up, that this is a really great place to look for ways you're thinking that's causing your own self pain. Because we're very clear, the members of the public that don't seem to be listening, the people that harm animals, all these things that cause pain, that's legit pain. We're not getting out of the legitimate pain. That is not what we're going to be able to do. But we can minimize some of this elective pain based in the way that we're thinking about stuff, right? That I think is the best we can do. Really address some of this optional stuff, because so that we can give ourselves fully to this non-negotiable stuff. We're in this field because we care deeply. We're not going to get out of that kind of pain. This, heck yeah. We can minimize this. All right. So let's talk about reframing, because that's what I'm encouraging you to do, right? Is reframe. So this is really a process that is based on thoughtful, conscious effort, right? Where are the words, my absolute words, the superlatives? This is the worst. Nobody, always, never, right? So noticing that, being very thoughtful about what you're actually thinking and saying to yourself, and then looking at the situation, some problem, an event, a person different than you usually do, right? Because the more we see something one way, the more seeable it is that way. So we want to actually click over and see stuff different than we normally do. That's not always easy. That's not always as easy as it sounds. And what they call it in cognitive behavioral therapy is they call it cognitive restructuring, right? So this is one of the most studied therapeutic approaches, and it is outrageously successful. So what it is, it's a technique that consists of identifying and then changing the way that situations or experiences, events, all these things are viewed, the way you see things. It's like an experiment where you're like, have you ever seen that movie Vantage Point? It's got Forrest Whitaker in it and some other really good actors. And it basically is just one event, and it shows the event from everybody, all the characters' viewpoint, right? And it's very different based on who they are, where they're standing, etc. And so this reframing, it's a technique where you can bring yourself through and mentally stand in different places. It's a process where your thoughts are challenged, right? Challenged. These cognitive distortions get to be challenged. And in the context of therapy, this is what it's restructuring, they call it. Again, extremely, extremely helpful. And if you are in therapy, if you're not doing CBT, I would say ask your therapist about it. And if you're not doing therapy, this is where the big bang for your bucks is. cognitive behavioral therapy, where you can reframe your whole life. We have all these notions about who we are, what's possible, and it's not true. It's all just a frame. It's a frame. We can be so huge, enormous people. The frame is what keeps us smaller than we can be. I know that for my own self. Okay, so that is what cognitive reframing and restructuring it is, and that's my plug for therapy, because I think therapists should get it. Everyone should be in therapy, I think. Maybe not for the rest of your life, but episodic, so that we can reframe stuff that gets stuck. Okay, so here I really want to say, I want this to land. If you want to improve your feelings, most of us are focusing on our feelings. We're like, I don't feel good, I want to feel better. If you want to improve your feelings, focus on improving your thinking and behavior. That is the key. So your thoughts are going to impact how you feel and behave, and your behavior impacts how you feel and think. So here's the best example I can think of. We don't have to feel like exercising to exercise. You don't have to feel like it. Many of us are waiting to feel like it, but we rarely do. In fact, mostly we don't feel like it. So there has to be other reasons, right? Feelings come and go. So we've got to go to thought, right? What's my thinking about it? Am I committed? Do I want to make a promise, right? How do I want to think about this exercise versus feelings? We're never going to feel like it, right? But you could behave your way into feeling like it. If you do it, whether you feel like it or not, eventually, I can almost promise, I'm not willing to promise, but almost, that you will eventually feel like it, because it will be good. You'll like it, right? So you can behave your way into new feelings, and you can think your way into new feelings. Very hard to feel our way into new behaviors. So this is really where you can get a lot of traction, is by thinking about your thinking and behaving based on your promises and commitments, rather than behaving based on feelings. Many of us are stuck behaving based on feelings. And when I do that, I don't exercise. When I behave based on my promise, I exercise. It's that simple for me. So I really want to stress this, that if you want to improve feelings, stop focusing on them and focus on your thoughts and your behaviors. All right. So I want to also just clarify, reframing is not optimism, and it is not positive thinking. That's not it at all. It's not faking it till you make it. It's not looking at the bright side, not looking at the bright side of a bad situation, none of that way. And like I said, it is not a way out of legitimate pain. It is a way out of elective pain, habitual thought type pain, right? Getting some relief from that. That is what reframing is. It's a way of looking at a situation and seeing what you're adding to the frame that, if you were to remove it, would provide enormous relief. So I want to just give you some other examples so you can really see how reframing might look, So when I was at the Paws Wildlife Center, I delivered a wildlife ethics workshop once a month. And it was for all new volunteers. We talked about the 11 most divisive issues in the wildlife rehab, right? Like, why are 12 rats, why is one owl worth more than all the rats? And things like that. And some of the people that were, when I told them about it, they were like, oh, because it was like 3-hour conversation on a weekday evening north of Seattle. Nobody wanted to come to it. They might find it interesting, but nobody actually wanted the experience of doing it. So as I told them and saw their facial expression, I didn't think of it this way at the time, but what I realize now is I helped them reframe. What I said to them is, I'm not going to try to convince you to believe certain ways, but what I want is for you to understand Paws philosophy so you can speak intelligently about it when you're here. That reframed it for them enough so because some of them just thought I was going to try and stuff philosophy down their throat. And really what I wanted was for them to be able to answer questions on Paws' behalf. And so we wanted to and it also helped massively with retention, because people really understood the why behind the decisions, even if they didn't agree with them. So that helped them reframe. So convincing them versus inviting them to understand was the reframe I offered. So that's one way how a reframe could look. Another one is around making mistakes. So most of us don't want to make public mistakes. Most of us know that we're supposed to have a good relationship with mistakes because everybody makes mistakes. Like, we're all told that. We tell kids that all the time, but most of us want to be very private about them. We also know that when learning something new, mistakes are inevitable. We have all these thoughts about mistakes, right? And some of us have very little freedom to make them. So the way you hold mistakes, the way you have mistakes framed, I'm guessing if you think about it for 2 seconds right now, you will see how you have mistakes framed. I want to give you an example so you can all keep seeing it, right? My first job out of graduate school, I worked for these 2 women who had a consulting company, and I made my first medium-sized mistake probably about 2.5 months in, where I sent an email to the wrong person, and it caused this chain reaction of inquiry, like, wait, what? And they thought they hadn't done something, and this was like the executive VP of some company. And so it was like, medium size. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, but I wasted a fair number of people's time. And my boss, you know what she did? She said, I was wondering what your first mistake was going to be. And then she took me out to lunch to celebrate my first substantial mistake. And I was like, wow, that's an interesting frame, right? She really wanted to make sure I understood that she expected mistakes and that I wasn't going to get penalized for them, that was just part of it. So that she framed the whole thing by taking me to lunch, right? And the way she responded. Whereas she could have framed it very differently. She was framing it for the company because I was new, right? So how mistakes are framed going to be a huge part of your experience as someone who maybe is training somebody or someone who's learning new skills consistently, right? So really understanding your relationship to making mistakes and reframing that if you see fit. Absolutely. And I'm more than happy to help you go through that's, go through some steps to get you there. That's a huge one. And here's some other ones. Managing piles. So when I was at the Paws Wildlife Center, I went to this manager training, and I remember one sentence from the training, and I hope you remember this sentence too. It changed my entire relationship to my desk. The guy said, your job as a manager is not to get rid of your pile. It is to manage your pile such that the wrong thing does not get left undone. Your job as a manager is not to get rid of your pile. Your job is to manage your pile such that the wrong thing doesn't get left undone. So that reframed everything on my desk. It reframed how I approached my day. It reframed how I ended my day. It reframed management for me, right? So that was a really, really great reframe for me and gave me enormous relief from the stuff I was leaving undone for that day. That doesn't work quite as well when your pile is animals. I understand that. But for your administrative work and stuff like that, that is a brilliant reframe. That's a whole nother conversation when you don't have enough people that actually do the animal care work. We're not talking about that right now because we have 9 minutes left. Using and instead of but. That's a reframe right there in itself. If you hear yourself saying, well, I like this, but I want to go to France, but I make this much money. Try reframing it and saying, I want to go to France and I make this much money. It leaves something there, some kind of possibility. The word but really kind of snuffs out possibility sometimes. And then smoking cigarettes. This one was super useful to me, and I'll offer it as how I reframe. So I quit smoking cigarettes quite a few years ago while I was actually working at Paws. And I made a list of all the reasons I wanted to smoke and all the reasons I didn't want to smoke, because it had been framed such that I was giving up something I wanted. That was the frame. I need to give up this thing I like doing. That's the frame. And therefore I'm left with just that. Now I don't get to do what I want to do. But what I was coached in the smoking cessation program, make 2 lists, all the things I want like about smoking, everything I want and everything I don't want. And then I get to have what I want. I pick one list. Either way I go, I get what I want. That was the reframe I needed. That was exactly what I needed personally. Before it was give up something you want. And the way it was is always have what I want. Very powerful for me. And lastly, I'll share with you my most recent is I lost a friend last year, and I started thinking, it just occurred to me that I get to sit in traffic. I get to be on hold with Comcast. I get to be one single drop of water for that person. I get to be spit at by somebody who doesn't like what I have to say, right? I get to be part of this euthanasia, and I get to make sure that this suffering is over, right? I get to be part of this because I'm that strong, I'm that talented, I'm that skillful, and I'm that brave. I get to do all of this because that's who I am. That's a different way of thinking about being inside this, right? Okay, so those are some reframing examples I want to share with you. And here's the biggest frame I think humans are in. Just want to give this to you to think about. There's a lot great videos if you want to go further with it. The locus of control is a theory in personality psychology, and it talks about where we really believe our power is. We tend towards internal locus of control, or we tend towards external locus of control. We tend to think I'm responsible for my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, or we tend to think that the circumstances around us and the other people around us give us our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Like we're just responding to what's around us. So this is the big frame. This is a big frame that we're all in, right? If you lean too far over to the internal, you might be trying to control things that aren't really yours to control, right? I'm responsible for my own and everybody else's. Sometimes we think that. If we're really far over on the external, we might not take responsibility for anything, right? So I think, I'm suggesting you look at where you tend towards, and some of the language you might hear if you have an internal locus of control are some of these statements, right? At first you don't succeed, try again. That's very internal locus of control. Practice makes perfect, all those things. External locus of control is why did things happen to me? You get what you get. I'm so lucky, right? That's just the way I am. Doesn't matter. It'll never change because the power source is out there. Now, I think internal locus of control is slightly more empowered because you get to be in control of your reaction and response. So, for example, let's say I think Johnny, who I'll just keep picking on, Johnny is really annoying. And if I have an external locus of control, that means every time Johnny's around, I'm annoyed. You put Johnny in front of me, Johnny's in charge of my emotions. Johnny's annoying, right? But if I switch to an internal locus of control for a second, Johnny shows up, I might say, why do I get so irritated when Johnny shows up? What is it that what's going on over here that has that be so irritating for me? Who does he remind me of? What am I making up? What am I making something mean, right? It's over here. I'm responsible for what's happening over here, right? Just like I'm giving this training and you're all having different reactions probably. Well, I hope you're all enjoying it and getting good stuff from it, but you're going to take away different highlights because of who you are, right? Okay, so that's locus of control. So here's some stuff. When you feel stuck, what you can do, acknowledge you've got a perspective. Just acknowledge it. I've got a frame. Let's look at it. Distinguish what actually happened or what's going on from what meaning you're adding, what you make it mean. Notice what you add because we're always adding something. Review the cognitive distortion list and identify any influencers, right? Did you use the word always? Never, right? Consider how you might inquire into whatever that stuck situation is if you were just starting to learn about it. What questions might you ask? What information would you need in order to have enough to understand fully? Articulate the stuck situation from the internal locus of control and an external locus of control. And notice, reflect on the difference, right? And that doesn't have to be this long homeworky thing. It could just be like 1 or 2 minutes. And then reframe it. Just reframe it. Tell a new story. Tell yourself a new story. You can make it silly. You can just experiment with a new story and then reframe. All right. So we have just a couple more minutes. I do see one question. Do I have any literature for the ethics wildlife class? Yes, I actually wrote an article and it's in the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association's journal. And feel free to email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. If anybody would like, I'm going to type my answer. So I'm sending my email through the Q&A. So feel free to email me and I can send you a copy of that. Because it basically talks about the process I used, and it talks about all the topics that I suggest that I included. You may have different topics based on how you operate, but I'm happy to share that with you. And you can also go to NWRA and get it as well. Yeah, any other questions that I can answer?
Alrighty, thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us this weekend. That was great. We're gonna get ready to hop over to our next speaker.
Wonderful. Have a great conference, everybody. Thanks for letting me participate.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us this weekend.
Bye.